So why Armis? What's Armis all about? What you guys are looking at here is basically what we describe as an explosion of devices that are occurring in organizations. I always like to pick on the IoT devices, OT devices, etc., because they're out there and they're prevalent. But the reality that we're looking at these days is that organizations have a very difficult time getting their arms around CIS controls 1 and 2. And what contributes to that? Well, you've got all these things like wireless printers and cameras, but you also have all these mobile devices and wearable watches, and now you've got cloud assets and virtual assets and people working from home. And all these are creating a lot of challenges in getting your arms around what all those devices are. Going back to pick on specifically IoT type devices, these are especially challenging because they're basically unmanaged. They can't run an endpoint agent on them. They're difficult to see. They easily connect to the network. They're not designed for security. And they've got compute power and horsepower. And so they represent a really vulnerable part of the organization. And that's why I always like to talk about it. And every organization you walk into has IoT devices. And it goes over into manufacturing devices with OT technologies, and it goes over into medical organizations with medical IoT too. But drilling that back up a level, these devices are all over in organizations, and with this dissolving of the perimeter in a corporate organization, we see these assets are everywhere. And lots of companies have made investments in technologies that are represented here on these screens. And each of these have their own versions of what those assets are. They've got their own pane of glass, if you, or window or optics around it. And the challenge is that these are not in agreement. All these silos don't reconcile very well against each other. So when somebody's actually trying to understand what all their Windows platforms are that are out there because of a new vulnerability that came out, how do they manage that? How do they get to the right answer for the organization and make sure that they've mitigated that risk or they have addressed all that patching? So there's no single source of the truth. This moves up the scale then and makes it very difficult to have policy management then across the whole organization and a level of security that's consistent across the organization if you don't have agreement on what all these different assets are. So questions that we often hear from people that we're talking about is, the challenges about how clean their CMDB is, or do they have their endpoint protection or EDR on all the assets that are out there? Are their vulnerability scanners actually working and catching all the assets that they're supposed to out there? How do I gain visibility to my OT network? How do I gain visibility to my medical devices that have FDA restrictions on them? What do my virtual assets look like today? What are my assets in a person's home doing these days? And how can I get optics into that if the endpoint's not running or the EDR is not running? So these are the types of questions that we're helping organizations out and addressing. Well, the how do we do this? Armis basically takes the approach of attacking this with 3 pillars. And what we are is an agentless, purpose-built platform that runs continuously and real time. And what we do is we do asset discovery for you. There are 3 different ways that we gain that information. I'll dig into those here in a moment as I give you this overview. But the first thing we do is we discover all assets in your organization. And when Armis talks about asset discovery, it's not just IP address, MAC address, make, model. We go into the extreme details. Okay, when did that device come on the network? When is it leaving the network? What's its behavior like? What ports is it communicating? What protocols is it using? Who else is it talking to? When is it doing that talking? What's its frequency of pattern? What's it look from a Wi-Fi perspective or a network? What's the chatter? What's the drop? What's the loss? What's the jitter? All that type of stuff is captured by us when we actually look at these devices and analyze them. And we use that information in certain cases in the passive techniques of looking at traffic to identify all these unique devices. Once we've identified the devices, then what we're doing is we're measuring at the amount of risk that that device introduces to your organization in the context of how you use it. And that's the key part about this. Context matters. To give you an example, an organization may be using a tablet, right? A tablet PC that could be used as a check-in kiosk, when we visit a corporation as a visitor. It could be used by an executive walking around the organization to take notes, do email, access the internet, etc. Or that same tablet could be used to control audiovisual equipment, do light web surfing in a conference room. It doesn't move from the conference room. Same device, but three very different use profiles and three different behavior profiles. One's moving across access points. Another one has only one or two apps running on it and almost always generating traffic to a printer. It only operates during the business hours of the day. So all these things have profiles around them. What Armis is able to do is we recognize each of those behavioral profiles, and we can tell you if a specific device has a risk profile that is greater than it should be because it has a behavior that is anomalous. And so that's the key part. We measure that for every device that we see in your organization. It doesn't matter if it's an IoT device or a managed device or a cloud asset. We do that for everything that we see in the organization. So you get a very good assessment of what your organization is, how it looks from a risk profile perspective. We also look for things that are policy violations. Policy violations could be something like, a device communicating using SMBv1, something that has unencrypted credentials going back and forth, or it's got default admin credentials on it, something like that. Those are also types of things that we recognize with our device and that we're going to raise to the security organization. So the third pillar is where our partnerships with technologies like Checkpoint come in, and that's like, okay, what do you do with this information? It's great to have this information, but how do I make it actionable? How do I help the lifting across the organization? So what we do is we help both protect the organization and inform it by lifting up all the other tools in the organization. If it's a transient device that just came on the network, that's something like a PC or a laptop that hasn't been on for a little while, we're going to help the scanner kick off a scan against that. That's outside of the window when it would scan that normal part of the network where that one belongs. If it's assets that the organization has not seen before, they're new assets, we're going to help get those loaded into the CMDB or the enterprise asset management system in some way, shape, or form. If it's an event that's coming across that needs to be exercised by the SOC team or something like that, or the vulnerability management team, we're going to feed that information over to a Canis system or a Splunk system or something along those lines. So again, what we want to do is give you actionable information that can drive actions and help break down those silos that we were talking about earlier. If you look across the customer base here, across the bottom, you see that we've got very large scale organizations that are global in nature. So we have no problems in those areas with this cloud-based platform that we have. So where do we get all this information? We pull it in via APIs, first of all, against other tools that are in your environment. So that means talking to Azure or AWS, talking to endpoints via like a Tanium or a CrowdStrike, talking to systems like your ServiceNow as a CMDB, or talking to the Splunk system. So we use all that to bring all that information about assets together and enrich it, rationalize it, deduplicate it for you. So you've got a single view of all those assets. Whether you choose to look at those assets in Armis or whether you choose to push them to a different platform, it doesn't matter to us. What we want to do is deliver that value today so you guys are all working from the same set of sheets, okay? So discover those assets, identify the gaps, automate the enforcement. Here's some examples of those actions and orchestrations that we do. I alluded to some of these earlier when I was talking about that third pillar. Here they are. But this is where we tie into Checkpoint. So when we see traffic that's unusual or assets that need identification, what we do is we help push that information out to the Checkpoint firewall. They can create automatically policies to deal with the security of those different devices by controlling their behavior in the way that it should be expected within that organization. So that's the tie-in to the Checkpoint side. And with that, what I want to do is go ahead and pass the baton over to Aaron and let him go ahead and speak about his slides and the Checkpoint and our integration together and how we lift all these tools up to give you guys more value.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. So brief introductions. My name is Aaron Rose. I'm a security architect for the Mid-Atlantic and Federal Division of Checkpoint. So specifically, I work within cloud technologies, secure DevOps, and then of course, Internet of Things. Unfortunately, I can't say that I've been brewing, beer for 13 years by any means, but I can say that I've been drinking a lot of brews for quite some time. I won't tell you how many years, but we'll stick with that. So I'm going to share my screen here. One second. And talk a little bit about what Checkpoint does and how we work with Armis. But before we go there, I want to give you an interesting example, because a lot of the things that you've heard about, these IP cameras, these watches, etc. I was kind of looking around my office. You might have noticed I was looking around, scrambling here. I have most of these things in my house, and it's kind of terrifying sometimes, being a security engineer or security architect or professional in general, and knowing the vulnerabilities that exist within these things. I mean, here on my desk, I grabbed this just for example. I bought this camera the other day. So I wanted to use this. I've got a couple at my grandparents' house for them, but this was going to be a new advanced one that has all the cool pan, tilt, zoom stuff. And what was really interesting is once it got delivered by Amazon, it took me all of maybe 45 minutes to realize that Telnet was open on it. And I found a number of vulnerabilities within it, and it was pretty terrifying in general. I've got the watch on my wristband connected to Wi-Fi, all of my lights in my house, my thermostat, everything. Well, I might not be a large enterprise, I don't have a lot of sensitive customer data. It's still pretty terrifying when you think of it in that sense. I spent quite a bit of time today actually researching smart locks, excuse me, smart locks, and what the most secure approach to having a smart deadbolt on my home would be. And I'll just let you know that I will not be installing one in my home. So just kind of bringing it home for everyone. So I wanted to start with a couple stories. So this one was, this one's really interesting. A lot of people are probably familiar with it. But a few years ago, there was actually one of the biggest and the most relevant hacks that came from an IoT device. So there was a casino that had a very large aquarium, and the aquarium had a number of sensors, for monitoring the water quality, the temperature, the filters, etc. And those sensors were connected to the internet, or they were connected to Wi-Fi. So this actually allowed an attacker to get in once they had control of those sensors of the small, maybe it was a Raspberry Pi computer or something of that nature. But once they had control of it, they were able to pivot within the network. And I think the number that we started to finally realize was the truth was over 10 terabytes of data was exfiltrated out of the organization to another country. So there was a lot of different reports about what that data was. So we don't really have definitive proof of exactly what it was or what kind of damage it caused, but it definitely opened a lot of people's eyes to that. Another one that's really interesting. So there's been a couple different companies that have come out with these, but they're basically robots with a giant iPad on top. It allows you to do video conferencing, and the robot can follow you around. Really cool, right? I thought this was awesome. They actually had a demo where you could log into their system, you had to get in queue, and drive one of these little bots around. So what was really funny about the company that actually invented this is it was a pretty large robotics manufacturing company. And what happened is somebody basically forgot to shut down the robot, or they forgot to lock the door that it was in. So there were some people just, not script kiddies. They didn't, hack into it or anything of that nature, but they realized, hey, this robot's still online. It's nighttime. If I move it in a certain way, I can open the door and look, I can go explore this factory. They can go around, they can look for, trade secrets. Potentially they could have looked at customer data. No one really knows what this person or the actually multiple people found when they were driving this thing around the manufacturing plant. And really the terrifying thing to me here is that we're starting to take, the Internet of Things allows us to bridge the gap between, the virtual world where the damage is all zeros and ones to the physical world where it could actually cause potential damage to humans or to property. So that's really the pivoting point, I think, for me, at least personally. And then this one, I find personally very, very troubling. My good friend put this on here, and this is a slide that he prefers to use, but it creeps me out every time, so I'm gonna try not to look at the screen. So this, every time. So this was identified by a federal network agency in Germany, and basically it was a doll connected to the internet through Wi-Fi. Can't look at her. And what was really scary, so this doll allowed, parents to check in on their kids. Unfortunately, a lot of IoT devices are built, without security in mind. They're cheap, they're manufactured in other countries. You can find tons of them on Amazon, just like that camera I showed you, just like the Wi-Fi plugs I'm sure I have all over my house. And a lot of them are built on very simple distributions of Linux, like BusyBox or other slimmed down versions. And security practices really aren't taken into account. There's a lot of hard-coded credentials, if they even require credentials in the first place. So basically, this little doll was exploited, and some terrible people started doing terrible things with it, like quoting things like Hannibal Lecter and 50 Shades of Grey. So very, very terrifying things, and that really starts to even bring that even closer to home, because now we're talking about children. So I'm going to get off the slide because I hate dolls. They freak me out. So I apologize. So let's talk about what Checkpoint IoT or Checkpoint Armis do in the IoT space. So if you look across tools, just like Shodan, or if you're using Google Dorks, which is basically just a dorky term for how to manipulate Google searches, you can find a ton of hacks out there. You can find IP cameras, you can find baby monitors, sex toys even, home thermostats, medical devices, people hacking actual cars like the Jeep that they were able to pull over on the side of the road. Thankfully, it was just a proof of concept. But there's a lot of stuff out there that can be attacked and exploited. And then you have tools like Shodan that actually very easily, you can just do a little Google search and it'll tell you everything that's out there that has a default password or has a potential vulnerability that you could exploit. So what Checkpoint and Armis have done, and kind of the point that Keen was alluding to there at the end, is talking about, all right, now that we know these are on our networks, Armis handles the discovery, the risk analysis for us, and they basically feed that information to Checkpoint. So this allows us to create a policy specifically around IoT devices. So we can have an automatically updated policy that's tuned on your network in real time for these devices. Now that's cool. That's awesome access control. But really the exciting part, the part that I like the most, is the threat prevention piece. Checkpoint's been around for quite some time. We've had intrusion prevention systems for enterprise networks and SMB, et cetera. We've had those for a long, long time. Now, what's really great is we've now taken that software and we use that to virtually patch or prevent threats and exploits on these IoT devices. So when we see that malicious traffic, or when we see something that's vulnerable that's been provided to us through the Armis connection, then we can apply a virtual patch using the IPS to do so. So basically what the solution looks like altogether, we've got the IoT discovery engine, which is Armis. So that's going to identify it, it's going to classify them, and it's going to provide that information to the checkpoint management system, the security gateways. Based off of those attributes and all that granular information that we get from Armis, we're able to take that and generate a policy that's both access control and threat prevention. So we can enforce that policy using our threat prevention engines like anti-bot and IPS and antivirus, et cetera. Some very exciting things here. So overall, this is kind of what it looks like when it comes to the virtual patching. Our threat cloud, which is basically how we share all of our threat intelligence between mobile devices to endpoints to IoT devices to gateways or firewalls, our cloud solutions, we share all of this data in real time. So the threat cloud allows us to very quickly adapt to new threats and vulnerabilities and exploits. So that's always being fed down to the Checkpoint security gateway. And then we're able to take those vulnerabilities that we see within those devices, those IoT devices, and patch them, virtually patch them using IPS. So that doesn't require that we make any changes to the device. We do have some more advanced controls around that, like embedding nano agents into devices, but that's a little bit outside of the scope or the time that we have today to go into. But it's very, very exciting and cool stuff to be able to actually take security down to that macro level with IoT devices, for example. So one other really great capability that we have now too is by taking that information, so that information that Armis is providing, we can actually look at the firmware of the devices now. And we can identify known vulnerabilities or hard-coded or weak credentials that are inside of there, what kind of domains that it's reaching out to, what the vulnerabilities are inside of that firmware itself, or if there's any kind of misconfigurations, or those domains that it's reaching out to, are they suspicious? Are they known to be spreading malware or exfiltrating data that they shouldn't be. It's when you get into the firmware and you start to look and see where it's, who it's talking to and what it's sending them, sometimes the results are not going to be what you want to see. So really quick, before I end, I want to show you an example of that firmware analysis, and this will be my last point. But this is one example that we did on a Honeywell camera. This actually was just a few days ago on the 6th. So Honeywell cameras, IP cameras are used, across the world, a little bit of everywhere. Everyone uses these. They're very powerful devices. They're very efficient and they work well. However, when we started looking at the firmware, we found it to be a high-risk firmware. And the reason for that is it had 20 high severity CVEs, it had 2 private keys that were completely unsecure. There were components embedded inside of that, so probably a slimmed down version of Linux that had high severity vulnerabilities. And on top of that, the credentials for it were weak or already known. So they were probably published to something like Shodan. So you can go through these reports and you can generate these reports on any piece of firmware that you have. We have a lot of them already done, pre-populated, but then if you have your own firmware, like a bin file or something of that nature for an IoT device, you can actually go and check that on Checkpoint's Infinity portal. So we can see some of the action items that it generates for us. Like, how can we fix this? How can we upgrade the security or get as close to perfect with security on this IoT device? Maybe we need to change the passwords. Maybe we need to secure or remove those private keys that are built in. Some of the binaries, maybe we need to reconsider those or add some additional flags to lock those down. So it's a very, very comprehensive scan and report, and I'd be happy to provide this to anybody that would like as a sample to look through in more detail. But I know everyone here wants to get to their cheese and their beer, etc. So I will, I'll stop sharing now. I'll jump away from the slides, and I hope you guys have a wonderful Oktoberfest.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Ethan.